Hi there. Now, this is a follow-up to the 60/40 correct score strategy automation video that I did the other day. So this is carry on with the testing, and we'll see how it goes. I've assigned the strategy to 3 different matches: the one at Bournemouth, Nottingham Forest, and West Ham, for a variety of reasons. I think the first 2, the odds are fine. The West Ham one, I think, might not trigger because the odds on West Ham are a little bit low. But I initially selected that one because my correct score spreadsheet is indicating that that should have quite a lot of goals. Whereas the other ones, Bournemouth at Everton, if we quickly bring that up, you'll see it looks like it's an ideal match in terms of the predicted score lines. Similarly for the Nottingham Forest match. They're hosting Crystal Palace today. And again, we'll see ideal score lines for these ones. So I'm primarily concentrating on Nottingham Forest and Bournemouth. What should happen, I think, based on the odds, the West Ham one won't get triggered because it's not meeting the odds. But while we're waiting for the matches to start, let me just show you a quick overview of the changes I've made to the automated procedure that I'd set up earlier on this week. We just pull up the strategy editor. There's a number of changes I've made and a number of additions. You'll remember from the previous video, I hadn't done any green up options. Those have been implemented, and I'll discuss those in a minute. But there's been some subtle changes I've made based on some of the feedback I got from that original video. One of the first things to note is I've changed when the first rule is triggered. I think it was 20 seconds I had. I've set it to 2 minutes. That's to give Fairbot time to actually open up the secondary markets it needs to check these conditions. I found that when I tested it the other day that it wasn't getting enough time to open these up prior to kickoff. So that's why that's been changed to 2 minutes. That gives it plenty of time. The other thing I've done is I've changed the requirement for the odds. The original strategy that you'll find on YouTube said both teams should be above 2.4 and above. Rather than me sitting around waiting for matches to meet that, I've reduced that to 2.24 just to give us some matches or more matches to test against. But obviously, if you're a football trader, you might want to tweak those figures. Similarly, I've tweaked the over-under. I did have a check on the over-under for the 2.5 goals and the over-under 1.5 goals. What I've done is I've actually increased that value for the over 2.5 goals so that it's less than or equal to 2.5. And I've removed the check on the under 1.5 goals simply so that Fairbot isn't opening up so many additional markets that all it's going to do is check. Keeping in mind all these checks here are to allow Fairbot to check if something meets the criteria rather than you having to sit down and check through a host of matches. So that's the first set of changes I've made. The other one is after each Dutch being placed, I've set up a rule that will play an audio message simply to say that the Dutch has been placed. So that happens after the 60% opening Dutch that should go in just before the kickoff. And then it will happen when either of the 40%, this one or this one, either of those is triggered, I should say. It will play that message again, saying that the Dutch is being placed. The other change I've made, again, based on feedback I got from in the other video, was the criteria to set the since time or time since unsuspended. I had it set to 30 seconds, I think it was. I was advised to change that to about 3 minutes, which I have done in all of these Dutch placements where the Dutch is going to be placed in running. And then finally, if we scroll down, I've got 3 get out clauses. The first one is a fairly basic one. It greens up after the second goal is scored and after 3 minutes has elapsed from the time the match was suspended, or the market was suspended, I should say. And then that will just green up irrespective of what the profit is. Now, there's certainly some argument to suggest that after the second goal is scored, you should wait to see, because there's some other scorelines will still be live depending on which goal is scored. So if it went 2-0, for example, you've still got the 2-1 and the 3-0 live. So there's an argument to suggest that rather than greening up across the field, you could just green up the 2-0 and leave the other 2 scorelines active, ideally for a bigger profit if a further goal was scored. So that's one option. Similarly, if the match went to 1-1, you then have the 2-1 and the 1-2 scorelines still active. So there's an argument to suggest that you should just green up the 1-1. All depends on when these goals go in, of course. So to keep life easy for me, all I've done is green up across the field whenever the second goal is scored. Now, if there's not a goal scored, I've got an additional rule that just keeps on in the market, and it will green up irrespective of what the trade-out position is if it's still 0-0. Keeping in mind that at that point, because there hasn't been a goal scored, there's been the 40% additional stake has not been entered into the market. So you'll be greening up on your 60%. So that should cut that down a little bit. And then secondly, there's another green up option where if there is one goal, of course we're waiting on a second goal to come. So it's going to green up at the 85-minute mark, effectively. So it's 40 minutes after the start of the second half. And that's trying to hold on for as long as possible for a second goal to be scored. Again, the football traders amongst you may have differing thoughts on that in terms of at what point that should happen. This is really just a first stab. Okay, so the 2 trade outs here, they'll kick in 90 minutes after in play. In other words, that's about 75-minute mark, including the 15 minutes for the half-time period. And that's it, effectively. So we'll see how that goes. I'm expecting the Bournemouth and Nottingham Forest matches to be activated and for the initial bet to go in. I'm not expecting the West Ham one unless the odds on West Ham rise a little bit in the few minutes we have before the kickoff. So what I'm going to do, we'll zip ahead and let's see those matches or those bets going in, and I'll periodically nip in and out the market throughout the afternoon to see how we're getting on. Okay, you can see that the Bournemouth-Everton match, the initial check has all been matched. That's been activated, so this will be placed. This Dutch will be placed in 20 seconds before the off. Similarly with Newcastle, that's all been confirmed. West Ham, however, as suspected, the match odds you can see there are 2.04. So unless there's a dramatic rise before the kickoff, this will not be executed, and consequently all the stuff underneath will not be executed either. I suspected that would be the case, but that's all part of the testing process in any case. So we'll switch back to the Bournemouth match. We're coming up for 20 seconds, so this bet should be going in shortly, and similarly on the Nottingham Forest match, we should get the Dutch for Nottingham Forest Crystal Palace. We'll just switch to My Bets tab, and we'll see those bets going in shortly within a few seconds.
Placing Dutch bet.
Okay, I don't know if you heard that. That was a placing Dutch bet message being played there. And there's the Dutch bets going in. You'll see I'm doing this in simulation mode, of course. I'm not going to commit £100 on each match while I'm testing this. So there we have our Dutch £60 liability at the moment, and it's now going to go in play. Similarly with Bournemouth, we get the same thing, all raring to go. So we'll just leave it as it is now. This match here is not going to be involved in. So in actual fact, what I can do, since that's not been met, I could actually come in here and remove it from the watch list. There's no need to have it sitting there and Fairbot monitoring those markets now. So if I just remove those. So we've got the 2 games on the go, and we'll see how it goes. So I shall come back periodically as and when there's been some action. Okay then, Bournemouth have just scored a couple of minutes ago, and so you'll see the additional bets going in on the 2-0 and 3-0. So the home team 40% Dutch has been placed, and of course because of the score doesn't meet the criteria, the corresponding Dutch on the away team hasn't been placed. So that's ideal. So you'll see now that we've got £100 in the market. We could green up manually for a small profit, but of course what we're going to do is hang around and wait for a second goal. So far the Nottingham Forest game is still 0-0, so once again I'll come back as and when something exciting happens. Well, that didn't take long for the second goal to go in. We haven't traded out as yet. We need to wait 3 minutes for the market to settle. And if we did at the minute, you'll see that we'll actually end up with a loss. This may be a function of how quickly that goal came. We may end up getting a loss anyway. But we need to wait a few minutes for the market to settle. So you see here the countdown timer here. It's coming up for 3 minutes. So it looks like it'll actually trade out for a loss, I think. Okay, so that's actually going to trade out for a loss, even though we are on one of our target positions. And so that's the first reservation I have about this particular method. Even though we're on 2-0, we still have 2 results that are still live, specifically 2-1 and 3-0. And that's simply because how quickly that second goal came, it put us in a poor position. So that's this particular trade done and dusted on the Bournemouth match, and we've round up with a small loss. So we'll just concentrate on the Nottingham Forest game now, and I'll need to think about other solutions for trading out. So in the Nottingham Forest match, it's still 0-0. So again, I shall come back as and when something exciting happens. Okay, Nottingham Forest have just scored, and the Dutch bet on the 2-0 and 3-0 has been entered. And you can see we are marginally in profit. But that will quickly disappear, I think, unless a second goal comes. If a second goal does come, we should realise a fairly substantial profit, which will be good since everything went belly up in the Bournemouth match. But one of the things I've been thinking out, I'm not convinced of the strategy as it is. I think it needs quite a bit of tweaking. So whilst we're watching this match, let me just run through some of the things that are running through my head. First of all, the initial Dutch, where we Dutch 1-1, 1-2, and 2-1. I'm not sure how sensible that is. Given that when there's no goal in the first half, the odds on the 1-2 and the 2-1 will increase fairly rapidly, whereas the 1-1 will stay relatively stationary. If there's not a goal, it won't start to increase until the second half. An early goal, of course, will change matters. But what I'm thinking is, rather than 60% at the beginning, choose something like 40% on the 1-1 and just back the 1-1 pre-kickoff, and then wait till about halfway through the second half and Dutch 1-2 and 2-1 at better odds than you would have got just before kickoff. So that's the first thing rattling through my head. The other thing is, as you saw in the Bournemouth match, where after 2 goals, it greened up across the field, we wound up with a guaranteed loss of £16 or thereabouts. Is there any value in, when the first goal goes in, greening up on the current scoreline? So when the first goal goes in the case of Bournemouth, we had a second goal fairly soon, so it was 2-0. Is it sensible just to green up on the 1-1, say, in other words, the next goal on, so that'd be the 1-1 or the 2-0, and so on. So rather than greening up across the board, is what I'm trying to say, green up each individual scoreline as and when it happens. That may be a better way of spreading the load somewhat. Because at the moment, we greened up ages ago, so around about this time here, on the Bournemouth match, for a guaranteed £16 loss. But there's been no goal since, so we have been sitting on a live scoreline all this time. But we've greened our position out completely. So I'm not convinced that's a viable option. And another thing that I may have mentioned in the previous video, after the first goal goes in, the strategy says Dutch the corresponding 2-0 and 3-0. The thing I don't like about that is if the other team then subsequently scores and makes it 1-1, that Dutch that you've just placed is completely wasted. So I'm thinking, rather than Dutching the 2-0, 3-0, why not just save half of that 40%? Just use 20% of your stake and back the 2-0 and leave that 20% for other purposes later on in the match. Possibly to cover the 3-0 should the need arise. So there's a whole host of things that I'm not overly happy with. But I'll let the football traders amongst you decide which ones have or are more feasible than the others. But as the strategy is at the moment, I can't say I'm overly happy with it. But then, having said that, I'm not a football trader. I don't like trading football. I just don't like the way the markets behave. So keep that in mind. The more experienced football traders amongst you may well be able to think of better ways of doing or implementing the automation process. I would be very interested to hear what your thoughts are on that. Okay, with the Nottingham Forest game still alive, we're looking for another goal, and that will put us in a very good position. But in the meantime, I shall pause the video and we'll jump ahead once something develops. Okay, we're coming up to the 85-minute mark and it's still 1-0 at Nottingham Forest Crystal Palace match. So our final trade-out position should be getting triggered any second. And as a result, we're going to end up with a bit of a loss. All right, so within, there it goes there, 40 minutes. And that's it. So we end up with a £60 loss, 60% if we trade out at 85 minutes. So it wasn't particularly successful today. £16 lost on the Bournemouth match. Oh, I see they've scored another goal. Nottingham Forest, £60 loss. So thankfully I was doing things in simulation mode. Yeah, the video is getting on for 25 minutes long now, so I think I'll just wrap it up there. Before I do, first of all, let me just apologise for my ramblings mid-video. As you can probably guess, I'm not convinced of the best way to trade out automatically from these positions. And I'm not convinced of the feasibility of too much tinkering. I'm of a mind simply to say, right, okay, let's just take this position for a Dutch at the beginning of the match and then green up if we hit, let's say, a 50% profit point, or red up if we hit a 50% profit loss point, irrespective of when that might happen in the match. I think at the moment, the way this particular strategy is detailed on YouTube is that there's too many things that you need to consider for the automation point of view and cover too many different angles to make it feasible. Certainly not without actually sitting in front of the computer and monitoring the match and so on, which kind of defeats the purpose of the automation. Anyway, so it's certainly food for thought. As I say, I have limited experience doing football trading, and so the football traders amongst you may have more, better thoughts on how to deal with how a match pans out from an automation point of view. Okay, we'll leave it there, and I'll speak to you later. Cheers.